Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very special presentation, part of the New England Biography series sponsored by the Massachusetts Historical Society. My name is Kanasoran Wangsri-Chanalai. I'm the Director of Research at the MHS, and it is my pleasure to briefly introduce you to our various seminar series, as well as the Disability History series, of which this program is a part, walk you through some of the tools of Zoom Webinar, which is the conference platform that we shall be using today, and then introduce your moderator for today later on. So first off, if you are unfamiliar with the MHS, this is part of our seminar series. We have 7 seminars that run over the course of the academic year. We have early American history, modern American history, gender, women's history, African American history, digital history, and this one, of course, the New England Biography series. Most of the seminars revolve around pre-circulated papers. These are works in progress in general. This series is slightly different in that it generally discusses works that have been completed in the genre of biography. We hope that you will visit our website, masshist.org/calendar, to learn more about what is coming up in our various seminar series. As I mentioned, this program is part of the Disability History series, which we in the research department, along with our colleagues in the public programs department and in the education department, are hosting over the course of this month, October 2021. I have listed here some of the programs that are coming up in the series for the remainder of the month. We have a couple of seminar papers, and we also have some public programs. For those of you who are unfamiliar with disability history, you may wish to join the public programs. Those are for a general audience. There is no pre-circulated paper, unlike with our seminar series. Those are designed to highlight the latest research on the subject. So again, take a look at our website, masshist.org/disability, to learn more about what is coming up. And so now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today. A member of the steering committee for the New England Biography series, Megan Marshall is the Charles Wesley Emerson Professor at Emerson College. A distinguished scholar and author, her biography, The Peabody Sisters, 3 Women Who Ignited American Romanticism, won the Francis Parkman Prize, awarded by the Society of American Historians. Her book, Margaret Fuller, A New American Life, won the 2014 Pulitzer Prize in Biography and Memoir. Her latest is Elizabeth Bishop, A Miracle for Breakfast. Professor Marshall's writings have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New York Times Book Review, Slate, and the London Review of Books. Professor Marshall, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Kanasoran and Katie Morris, who've put this program together through the seminars series. And thank you to the Mass Historical Society for sponsoring this great program. I'm so excited about the film that we were able to watch leading up to the discussion. Before I introduce our other speakers, I just want to say, if any of you are tuning in just for this panel discussion and had not had a chance to see the film, we could run a 5-minute clip from the film if you'd like. So let me know in the chat if that's something you'd like. We could work it into the program. Otherwise, we'll be assuming that people have seen the film and know what we're talking about. So I'm just grateful to Carolyn and John for giving their afternoon to this, and to everyone who's attending on a Saturday. I know I usually spend my a lunch hour toggling between Hillbilly at Harvard on WHRB and Standing Room Only, the show tunes on WERS, Emerson Radio. And today it happened that they're doing a special on labor in the Hillbilly at Harvard. So I stuck with that. But here we are today to talk about a labor organizer, as it turned out. So I'll give the introductions. I'm getting a request to show the clip, so we'll find a time to do that fairly soon. But first, I'm going to introduce our panelists, Gianvito and Carolyn Forché. And you're welcome to turn on your cameras, Carolyn and John, so that we can see you. So Gianvito, he's a colleague of mine, a professor in the Department of Visual Media Arts at Emerson College. His films include the feature films The Flower of Pain, Address Unknown, and The Mad Songs of Fernanda Hussein. His 2007 documentary, Profit Motive and the Whispering Wind, received multiple awards, including Best Experimental Film of the Year by the National Society of Film Critics and Grand Prize for Documentary Feature at the Belfort Entrevue Film Festival. In 2010, the magazine Time Out New York listed Profit Motive in a critics poll of the 50 greatest documentaries of all time. Gianvito has had retrospectives of his work at the Biennale Film Festival in Austria, Emile Occhi in Trieste, Italy, and the Cinema du Real Festival in Paris. His collectively made film, this is the most important thing about this announcement, his collectively made film from 2012, Far from Afghanistan, can be seen in a special benefit screening this Monday night, October 18th at the Brattle Theatre in Cambridge. 100% of the box office receipts will be donated to a fund for Afghan evacuation and resettlement. So do see if you can attend that, support that. Carolyn Forché, who appears as narrator in her Socialist Smile, is university professor and director of the Lannan Center for Poetics and Social Practice at Georgetown University. She's the author of 5 books of poetry, Gathering the Tribes, which received the Yale Younger Poets Award, The Country Between Us, chosen as the Lamont selection of the Academy of American Poets, The Angel of History, which won the Los Angeles Times Book Award, Blue Hour, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and In the Lateness of the World, a Pulitzer Prize finalist this year. Her prose work, What You Have Heard Is True, a memoir of witness and resistance, was published in 2019. And her 1993 anthology, Against Forgetting, 20th Century Poetry of Witness, is an indispensable resource. Forché has been a human rights activist for many years, and in 1998, she was presented the Edita and Ira Morris Hiroshima Foundation Award for Peace and Culture in Stockholm for her work on behalf of human rights and the preservation of memory and culture. So I have questions ready, but maybe, John, we should see the clip now so that people have something to focus on, those who weren't able to see.
So thank you so much, Megan and Kid and everyone working in front and behind the scenes to bring us all together this afternoon. It's a lovely, mild New England weekend afternoon, so I'm quite touched that people are sacrificing being outside to be with us for this hour. This is a clip from, I think, little over an hour into the film, and represents the period in which the socialist movement that Helen Keller had been actively engaged in was being systematically decimated by efforts in the government to dismiss these organized forms of radicalism in the face of an attempt to get a unified position around World War I. So, and it suggests the clip is sufficient to give you a sense of the formal ways in which the film operates. It's a little longer than 5 minutes, but I can stop it in around 5 minutes or so.
Go ahead, yeah.
On April 7th, 1917, one day following the US Congress's declaration of war on Germany and formal entry into World War I, an emergency meeting of the Socialist Party of America convenes in St. Louis, Missouri. By an overwhelming majority, the party denounces America's entry as a crime against the people, declares it a war imperialistic on both sides, and pledges continuous, active, and public opposition to the war through demonstrations, mass petitions, and all other means within our power. We will not willingly give a single life or single dollar. Within 2 months, President Wilson signs into law the Espionage Act, enabling sentences up to 20 years for anyone willfully interfering with military operations or recruitment. Immediately, socialists throughout the country are indicted, convicted, and jailed. A third of socialist meeting halls are destroyed, and dissemination of the majority of socialist publications are banned from the mails. On June 15, 1917, in New York, Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman are arrested during a raid on their offices, charged with conspiracy to induce persons not to register, and sentenced to 2 years in prison. In July 1917, in North Dakota, Kate Richards O'Hare is sentenced to 5 years in prison for making an anti-war speech. On September 5th, 1917, a national dragnet rounds up 166 senior members of the IWW, raiding the headquarters of the Socialist Party and of the IWW and 20 branch offices of the IWW in different states. Among them are many of Helen's close friends and allies, provoking her to send an impassioned appeal directly to President Wilson. Helen puts the president on notice. She makes the argument squarely. She lays her cards fully on the table, valiantly divulging more to the president. When Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik revolutionary forces seized power in Russia in the fall of 1917 in a nearly bloodless coup d'etat, the enthusiasm it generates among progressive circles worldwide is electric. For Helen Keller, as for many, the establishment of the world's first constitutionally socialist state offers from afar the promise that the dream of a more egalitarian and just restructuring of the world could in fact be made a reality.
That does give a great sense of the different modes in which the film operates. And on my end, some of the music wasn't as working quite as well as it does if you see the film originally, but that's a very powerful element when there is music. And I think for those of you who didn't see the film, the one other aspect that I think was really key of the way the film is put together is there are these wonderful sequences actually filming Carolyn reading from her script in the sound studio, and we can talk a bit about that later. But John, as this is the New England Biography series, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what got you interested in Helen Keller's life. Had you always known about this aspect of her life? And I guess I should explain, this was, as John said, about an hour into the film, a kind of crucial turning point, but there's a lot on either side of that moment of apparent victory in the Lenin's revolution.
Probably of all my films, this one had the deepest roots. Its origins date back to now about 21 years ago, when I was reading a text by the radical historian Howard Zinn, in which he made reference to this dimension of Helen Keller's life that had been wholly unknown to me at that point, that she had been not only an ardent but even militant socialist through much of her adult life. And I was immediately intrigued. It was not the portrait of Helen that I had grown up hearing about in class and in films like The Miracle Worker. And what I knew was the marvel that this blind, deaf young girl had learned miraculously to read and to write and to speak. But what she actually read or wrote about or spoke was somehow not then discussed. And so I did a little digging, and I was able to find fairly readily some of her speeches and some of her writings around socialist ideas, and became furthered my interest. And often, as I said, to many times I've said, it's when I read the writing, and I still read the writing, so much of it feels as if it could be speaking to our own historic moment. It feels that fresh and vivid and vital. And so I thought this could be a wonderful, how many people know about this? This could be a wonderful little film. And on and off for about a year, I started to pursue that. And to my surprise, given that Helen was, during her lifetime, maybe the most famous woman in the world other than the Queen of England, I could find absolutely no photographs, film footage, or audio recordings of this large swath of her life. Documentation about everything else, but other than the written materials, there was virtually no visual, none of the ingredients that typically a documentary filmmaker would seek out in order to embark on such an endeavor. And then I learned that there was an archive that might have some of this material. And those who've seen the film, this gets revealed, an archive called Helen Keller International. And right around the time I was doing this research, that archive, unfortunately, was destroyed when debris from one of the towers, World Trade Towers, fell on September 11th, 2001. And virtually everything there was lost. And so at that juncture, I just thought, okay, it was an interesting idea, but for a filmmaker, I'm not really sure there's something I can do with this. And I moved on to other projects. Fast forward to, I guess now about 4 years ago, I'd finished a film and was beginning to see what was percolating inside for for the next direction I might take. And this concept started reemerging. And the way I always tell the story, it's like it's a little voice in my head that's just telling me, okay, John, you said you had an interest in, the most historically famous blind, deaf woman. You have no images, you have no sounds. That's an interesting creative problem. You shouldn't be backing away from it. And at that point, I did feel like somehow I could embrace this. I had no idea where that would take me or how I would solve those challenges. But in earnest, I began. And so about 4 years ago, I started, and it was a 3-year process of bit by bit figuring out the solutions to how you make a film in the absence of orthodox archival materials.
Great. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about those technical decisions or technique decisions you made, but Carolyn, I want to draw you into the conversation. Was this aspect of Helen Keller's life new to you, and what did you learn by speaking? You're narrating, occasionally you speak her words as well.
When I was a child, she was a heroine in our household. My sister played her on the stage in a high school play. My mother spoke of her all the time. We saw a great deal about Helen Keller and not a word about her political views or her activism. But when I was in college, I was employed at the School of Labor and Industrial Relations Library. And the librarian had a file that she called her pink file. And in it, she had all the wobbly newspapers and all sorts of publications by socialists and socialist organizations during the 30s. And she gave me the task of not organizing this file, but actually sitting and reading it. And I think she just wanted to educate me. And so my job was to read this material and report back to her. And of course, in those files, I discovered Helen's name mentioned, not in the context of learning to speak, but in the context of her advocacy for workers in America and throughout the world. So I knew that was there, that was a strong dimension, but I didn't have there was no access to it. As far as I know, there's no popular book available about this part of her life, which was central to her life. I like what John said about they are fascinated that she could learn to speak and write, but they weren't so fascinated by what she had to say. So no, and then when I said to John, whom I'd worked with before, that I'd be thrilled, honored to narrate this film. I didn't know what he wanted me to do, but I trust him. So I went with that. I want to say something about what wasn't shown in the clip was my appearance on film. And I want to make clear that I did not know I was going to be on the film. Believe me, I wouldn't have been chewing my lunch when I walked into the room if I had known it. And I probably would have worn something a little more presentable. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But when he said, by the way, I must warn you, you're also on camera, I was surprised and a little worried because I wanted to be off camera. But I trust him, and it's all right. I think he made it. The decisions he made were right for the film.
That's fabulous to know. Yeah, John, you would work out that way?
It was an experiment. I probably should have forewarned Carolyn a little sooner because I think it made her a tad self-conscious throughout the day. Although I think it wore off, but here and there, I think you are aware that there are cameras around you, and it makes a difference. They weren't small cameras. They weren't.
Believe it or not, it never occurred to me that they were running video. It didn't occur to me because I was so focused on the pages in front of me.
I really learned to do this narration from John. He's very meticulous, and I've done a lot of poetry reading and been on tape doing things with poetry, but it's a very different matter when you are narrating a film. So I was so focused on that I didn't.
Yeah, I mean, we had work to do, and there was a camera also on me in, I don't know if Carolyn knows this, on me in the recording studio too, and I decided not to use that. But I didn't know if I was going to use any of it. It was just a, you know, documentary filmmakers for years have had to wrestle with the tradition of the so-called voice of God, invisible, omniscient narrator, and I just thought I had thought this before, and it was an idea I was saving to do eventually, but I thought if I were going to employ narration again, why not just see the person speaking and humanize that aspect of the film. And then it also makes a nice counterpoint to the silence of Helen's text, you know, to visually see.
I
learned something, John, about myself too. You filmed one of the parts that you put when I'm on camera. I'm rehearsing, whispering, rehearsing, and I didn't know I did that. I'm not aware of doing that sort of thing. So I thought that I do. It was, but I thought it was interesting the way the whispers worked.
Yeah. That fabulous moment, very noticeable in a good way. So, John, I want to ask about the text that we're reading in silence, Keller's words. And when I experienced that for the first time, I had this kind of panic, such as I used to feel in grade school when we did, what were they called? Film strips, you know, and you had to learn something and then you'd be tested on it afterwards. And could I read fast enough? But I relaxed into it and enjoyed the text. And then it made me think how lazy we are in our consumption of film or entertainment or whatever it is. It called upon me to engage in the film in a way that I thought was really extraordinary. And but I don't know what your decision or thought was about those passages.
Well, the decisions arose gradually and organically, faced with the fact that, as I said, I didn't have any recordings of Helen delivering such remarks, and I could have opted to have an actress pretend to be Helen, or someone, or just as people may see if they tune in this week, PBS on their American Masters series is premiering on Tuesday, a project I think has been worked on for as many years as I've been thinking about this project, a documentary called Becoming Helen Keller. And I haven't seen it yet. I've seen the few clips that they have online, and I think there's some commendable things they're doing, but a very different type of approach than mine. But they do have just an actress on screen reciting her words. That's a one way one can go, or you have them through voiceover with other kind of imagery underneath. And I find that approach, me personally as a viewer, I find that I can't quite fully give my attention to both things at once. And I really was mostly interested in people ingesting these ideas and having time to ruminate about them. And I know when I read something, I don't like music on, I don't like other things happening. I like silence, and I like to just focus on this. And it was always intended as, in my mind, as a film about her ideas. It wasn't intended to be a biography of Helen Keller. There are biographical elements interlaced through the film, and I know this is a program on biography, but it was the biography of her ideas that was what I was sort of laser focused on. And I recognize that it's asking a lot of many people to have to read in a movie theater, that somehow that's a radical thing. But I could make the argument that it's not asking enough of people. I mean, really, what am I asking at all? People to watch a movie? That's not really a very big ask of the things out there. So, and all of my films, I tend to think of them as films that I only make 50% of them, and that the other 50% is made or not made by what people do with the form that and the contemplative space that I give them. And so, as you were experiencing, Megan, yourself, you have to sort of step up and interact with it. It doesn't do the work for you.
Yeah, it would have been, I'm sorry we weren't able in the end to all watch it together in the room together, but I look forward to a day of that. And I should say, for those who haven't seen the film, there are moments where we do hear Helen Keller's own voice, not saying these words. I guess there are, I don't know how much recording there is of her voice, but we do hear it, which explains, I think, I wouldn't want an actress portraying her after having heard her actual voice. So it seems to me you made very smart decisions. Another aspect that we saw in the clip were these vaudeville routines, which again, the first time I saw it, I said, John, did these really happen? You know, but yes, you did the research, and these are actual kind of routines, I guess, that she scripted. Is that right?
Well, not exactly. So from 1920 to 24, and Annie Sullivan and Helen were out on the vaudeville circuit, and it was I guess for Annie especially, a difficult decision, because she kind of looked her nose up a bit about that whole world, and so did other friends of theirs. Thought it was beneath them to be on the same stage with acrobats and people being sawed in half and what have you. But Helen apparently loved the experience, loved the people she got to hang out with, and practically they made more money doing it for 20 minutes. Their act was 20 minutes, and they could stay in one town for a while and not keep traveling when they were just on the lecture circuit. So I could describe at length what their act was, and that was scripted, but the tail end of it ended with questions and answers from the audience. And over time, I was able to assemble a compendium of those responses, and where Helen is enormously sharp-witted, and I pulled more of the ones that had to do with her political convictions, and so I had that material and I wanted to use it, and I thought, well, how do I make that also a cinematic ingredient within this film? And thought if I could get access to an existing vaudeville theater, if any remain, that might be one route to go. And where she and Annie began their tour does still exist. It's the most famous of the vaudeville theaters, the Palace Theater in Manhattan. And I thought to myself, well, what are the odds are this Times Square Theater is going to let this independent filmmaker come in and use their facilities to do this? But they were very responsive, and they said that unfortunately at this moment we're doing an unlimited run of SpongeBob SquarePants the musical, and they have a copyright over their image, and we can't really allow that to be used. And I said, well, that's fine. I have no interest in that. I thought maybe I could get in early in the morning and just film the empty stage with this idea of putting the questions over it. And they said, well, it doesn't even look like a stage anymore. We're using blue screen, and it just wouldn't look like what I think you are looking for. So I'm sitting in my office at Emerson and thinking, okay, Helen performed in Boston. Where might that have happened? And lo and behold, I was sitting right next to where that happened. Not the Paramount Theater at Emerson is a little down the block from where the theater was that Helen performed in, but the designs that were used in the restoration of the theater are, in fact, the design of the stage that she performed in. And because I teach there, it was very easy to gain access.
That's great. So another element is, which we saw in the clip, the natural scenes, some of which we find out in the end, I guess, were filmed around the house that Annie and maybe all around the house that Annie and Helen lived in. But I know that, you know, Helen herself speaks in the film of the nature's wizardry. And I think you had a passage that maybe Carolyn could read of.
Yeah, just leading into that. So this was, to me, a key portal that opened up during the months I was trying to figure out how you know, what cinematic elements could I bring into this work. And as I read more and more of Helen's own writing, I discovered that not only did I share this love of socialism, but that she had a profound love of the natural world, and wrote about it with incredible vividness and passion. And so and then I discovered that where she was writing this was about 10 minutes from where I live currently, which I had no awareness of for the first 6 months or so I was working on this. But as just one example of the eloquence in which she describes her feelings about nature, I just found a passage before this talk today and thought it'd be lovely to hear Carolyn read it.
This is from Helen Keller's The Open Door. Hold out your hands to feel the luxury of sunbeams. Press the soft blossoms against your cheek and finger their graces of form, their delicate mutability of shape, their pliancy and freshness. Expose your face to the aerial floods that sweep the heavens. Inhale great draughts of space. Wonder at the wind's unwearied activity. Pile note on note the infinite music that flows increasingly to your soul from the tactual sonorities of 1,000 branches and tumbling waters. How can the world be shriveled when this most profound emotional sense, touch, is faithful to its service? I am sure that if a fairy bade me choose between the sense of sight and that of touch, I would not part with the warm, enduring contact of human hands.
Oh, thank you. And Carolyn, I think you were just reading that maybe for the first time. Brilliant, my gosh. You put us to shame. Anyway,
this is why
inspire us. Inspire us incredibly. But maybe it's a good idea to say a little more about Keller's writing, which is so strikingly clear. And I don't know, I'm a teacher of writing, so I think now I'm going to look for some of Keller's writing to assign as just examples of great, clear writing about ideas. Her thinking is clear, her writing is clear, and how remarkable that is, and how sad that, you know, we have so little of it given to us to read in our educations. Do you know what her sources were, how she became the writer she was?
Well, she always said that literature was her utopia. It was where she felt that she wasn't disenfranchised, and so she and she recognized that she also came from privilege and garnered increased privilege as her celebrity grew. So she had the ability to request books to be put into Braille for her to some degree. Although a lot of her reading was done through finger spelling onto her hand by Anne Sullivan or by Anne Sullivan's husband, John Macy, through a lot of her formative years. But she read voraciously. She learned 4 or 5 languages. She read international periodicals. You know, she was very interested in international affairs and news, but also in poetry. She wrote poetry. She wrote a book-length poem. She wrote the introduction to a poem by a volume of poems by Arturo Giovannetti, I think is how you say it. It was one of the labor organizers of the IWW in the famous Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence. Beautiful, lengthy introduction she wrote to that volume. You know, when you're around words constantly, then I mean, it's not the only reason that explains her eloquence, but it certainly enabled her to think about words more readily.
Carolyn, do you want to say anything about Keller's writer?
I hear the cadences of Walt Whitman in that passage that I read, and partly perhaps because it's an address, you know, to a people, but also, you know, the beautiful litany of images and the accrual of the sensorium that she builds there and invites us to acknowledge that we have all about us all the time. One of the things that I felt about the sequences in the film, when we're just observing a leaf fall or branches or water, is that they're otherwise silent, except for the sound of the nature. But I feel like it's a moment when we are invited to consider the interior world of Helen herself and what most sustained and nourished her, and to have a quietness with nature, but vividly aware of it sensorily. So I thought that was really beautiful. And we like to think when we're considering political activists and people who are deeply committed to humanitarian concerns and social justice, that is all there is to them, you know, and that their minds are so preoccupied diligently with purpose and with dedication that we don't imagine that they would have what she had as well, which was this deep affinity with the natural world.
I think Helen would definitely have agreed with the remark that Rosa Luxemburg once made, that the fate of an insect is no less important than the fate of the revolution.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the ending, and a natural image that comes towards the end is of there's some kind of seed pods that are swaying in the wind and the seeds drift off. And when I first saw them, they looked to me like maybe cotton balls, almost cotton bowls, I guess, bowls, and which then reminded me that we learned earlier in the film that she grew up in Alabama with from a slaveholding family. And I wondered if that was, to me, that sort of brought it all together, the great move she had made to a different kind of world and a different kind of nature, and to, you know, kind of giving life rather than taking and subjugating life in her own lifetime.
It was Tuscumbia where her house was, and I gave a reading on March 10th, 2020, which was the very beginning of the pandemic, and my 5th book had just been published, and I traveled to Alabama to read at the University of Northern Alabama. And that was where the book was launched. And they didn't know anything about John's film or my work on it or my interest in Helen Keller. And they said, would you like to see Helen Keller's house? And I thought, I've got to go see it. Well, it is there, and it's become a museum. And as you might imagine, and it is surrounded by what would have been plantations, I would suppose. But you don't get much of her activism in the museum either. Her dresses, the china, the curios, the furniture that was actually there when she was growing up. And the last image that was taken of me before I went into lockdown was next to the water pump, where she learned the word for water, and it's still there. But the tour is entirely focused on that aspect of her acquisition of language.
Yeah. Well, at the end, we also learned she had made a trip to Japan some years before World War II, but then came back afterwards, not too long, I guess, after the bombing of Hiroshima, and visited there. And that's actually the passage in which she uses the phrase, the nature's wizardry. She says this blasted landscape is untouched by nature's wizardry. And I thought, you know, I know, Carolyn, you have written about that a bit. Is that a poem you could read to us? Or
if there's time.
Yes, please do. We have time, and maybe after that we can take some questions about the film.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was interested in Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings all my childhood. And we read John Hershey's book, Hiroshima, in school. I finally had an opportunity to travel to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1983 for the Asian Writers Congress, which was that year themed literature under the nuclear cloud. And I was taken to an ornamental garden and happened to be in the company of a woman who had been in that garden on the morning of the bombing. And it was her first time to go back. She worked up her decision to go back in our company, in the company of the poets. So her voice is here. The garden shook again. By way of a vanished bridge, we crossed this river. As a cloud of lifted snow would ascend a mountain. She has always been afraid to come here. It is the river she most remembers, the living and the dead, both crying for help. A world that allowed neither tears nor lamentation. The matsu trees brush her hair as she passes beneath them, as do the shining strands of barbed wire. Where this lake is, there was a lake. Where these black pine grow, there grew black pine. Where there is no tea house, I see a wooden tea house and the corpses of those who slept in it. On the opposite bank of the Ota, a weeping willow etches its memory of their faces into the water. Where light touches the face, the character for heart is written. She strokes a burnt trunk wrapped in straw. I was weak, and my skin hung from my fingertips like cloth. Do you think for a moment we were human beings to them? She comes to the stone angel holding paper cranes. Not an angel, but a woman where she once had been, who walks through the garden Shukeyen, calling the cart to the surface by clapping her hands. Do Americans think of us? So she began as we squatted over the toilets. If you want, I'll tell you, but nothing I say will be enough. We tried to dress our burns with vegetable oil. Her hair is the white froth of rice rising up kettle sides, her mind also. In the post-war years, she thought deeply about how to live. The common greeting, Dozo Yoroshiku, is please take care of me. all Hibaksha still alive were children then. A cemetery seen from the air is a child's city. I don't like this particular red flower because it reminds me of a woman's brain crushed under a roof. Perhaps my language is too precise and therefore difficult to understand. We have not, all these years, felt what you call happiness, but at times, with good fortune, we experience something close, as our life resembles life, and this garden, the garden, and in the silence surrounding what happened to us, it is the bell to awaken God that we've heard ringing.
Thank you.
It's really extraordinary, Carolyn, and again, it so much evokes to me that feeling that only poetry can express what is ultimately inexpressible, but that we all somehow know or need to know or be reminded of. I thank you.
Thank you.
I want to just also say one last thing that comes at the end of the film. You know, what we're talking about history here and the history that people bear and can relate to us. But I was really struck, and I don't know really where it came from, Helen's comment. She says, never turn away from the new generation's knowingness, because the new generation is our hope. And I love that phrase, the new generation's knowingness, because it's so much that's, again, something that John said is very much in the news today. Are the young people telling us, is their knowingness what we should listen to? I happen to believe it is as well. So I was very glad to have that come at the end. So I'm glad for your poem. Thank you, Carolyn. I think we can take questions for a while. We have a bit of time. Maybe, Kid, will you field the questions?
Certainly. So we have a couple of questions that go along the same line. So I'm just going to try to lump them together.
Mm-hmm.
One anonymous attendee writes, would you think that there was no information about Helen Keller's socialism because of Joe McCarthyism? Another asks about the memory of Helen Keller. Why is she remembered for her physical disability as opposed to her political stance? What are your thoughts on that? And another wonders, did she ever get tired, in essence, of being defined by her disability as opposed to her political positions?
Well, she definitely, close friends of hers have commented in their writing how she just hated being, lavishly praised as a living saint and living miracle and all those kind of terms. It was a burden that she, didn't take. Struggled with, wrestled with, and in terms of the sort of whitewashing of this side of Helen, which thankfully is, I think times are changing, and you're seeing that in any of the new literature that has come out about Helen. I particularly recommend a book called The Radical Lives of Helen Keller by Kim Nielsen. I've just been out for a while, but certainly this new PBS program will touch on this part of her. I also just read that there's a fiction film that one of the studios is working on called Helen and Teacher, with a young deaf actress who has been in some films that have been getting attention lately, and it will deal with her period at Radcliffe and her gradual politicization. So things are changing, but it's true, the McCarthy period and even before that, there was a real effort to discredit these ideas, which had started to gain traction and legitimacy. It wasn't calling yourself a socialist didn't produce a kind of knee-jerk reaction of hostility or as we see with the Republican use of it, that it's you're supposed to immediately just see it as a pejorative if you're called a socialist. I found this quote that socialism is a scare word Republicans have hurled at every advance the people have made in the last 20 years.
Okay.
That was said by President Truman in 1952. So, we're still dealing with that dismissal. And it is true that Helen was a somewhat less vocal about her beliefs after the Socialist Party itself was taken apart, and after she was asked to become the public face of the American Foundation for the Blind, which is where she worked for the last 40 years of her life. And it's known that the board of directors there looked down on her association with what they call communists or near communists, and that it was an embarrassment to them. And they, as the main holder of Helen's archives, it's my belief that in those early years they willfully expunged any of those materials, which is not mentioned in the film, but I think that's also a big part of why some of this material has vanished. So I don't think it was, though, just Helen. I mean, we see this with so many other of our, those figures we choose to turn into sort of our national heroes, and we want a very simplified version, uncomplicated version of their life. And actually, Helen is quite complicated. My own film doesn't really deal with some of the problematic dimensions of Helen Keller, because it wasn't really what I was focused on. But I worry about, even in my own way, contributing to a kind of hagiography around Helen Keller. Wasn't my intention. But you look at a figure like Rosa Parks. People. I grew up thinking, this was just an elderly woman who was weary one day and just didn't want to be told to go to the back of the bus, and that triggered, this movement. When in fact she was a lifelong organizer, had gone to the Highlander School for training. Her idol was not Martin Luther King, it was Malcolm X, and she knew exactly what she was doing. But why don't we know that when we were told the story of Rosa Parks? I recently saw a documentary a few weeks ago on Paul Robeson, a beautiful rare documentary called The Tallest Tree in the Forest. And it's a 2-hour documentary. In the very last scene in the movie, the narrator tells you that everything you've seen in this film, we were only able to find in foreign archives. We couldn't find anything about him in the country that he lived and did rose to fame in. So this is a endemic problem with how we construct our histories.
Thank you. There's also a clarification from someone. It sounds like there was no aspect of arson in the 2 fires that destroyed much of Keller's archives. Now, the second one was a terrorist attack. What about her house in Connecticut? It
was just a bad old furnace that that caught fire somehow when she was out of the country. And so, no, there was no willful effort to, in either case. The only willfulness, as I said, I think was in the early years of the American Foundation for the Blind. It's not their orientation today. I want to make that clear. But I saw a note where someone had looked through all the photographs of Helen inside the archive and said there were 2,000 pictures of her, and there was only one where her face looked tense and tearful, and written on the other side in pencil was too tense, throw out or discard. So they didn't, but that shows me that there was a point in time where someone was expunging things that didn't fit the public face that they wanted to put forward of Helen Keller.
A follow-up question on that. If these sources had not been erased or destroyed, how might that have changed how you told the story or the narration portion of the documentary film as well?
I'm sure it would, but maybe there wouldn't have been as much of a compelling need for me to have made the film. And we could be not just talking about Helen's interest in socialism, but just socialism itself and why we still haven't gotten there. Because that's really what I'm interested in, people coming away with the film is re-engaging a bit in the legitimacy of these ideas, and perhaps having such a beloved historic figure acknowledged and having given them such considered reflection opens a space for some people to see what that was all about, because early in the last century it was a burgeoning movement, and polls today show that among, Megan was mentioning the youth today, that among young people today, they're when asked about socialism, it does seem to be garnering greater interest.
Thank you. It's just a reminder to our audience members that they can join the conversation by raising the hand or typing questions into the Q&A box. Our next question here comes from Julie Dobrow, who's another member of the steering committee for the New England Biography series. John, which film conventions do you think help us understand someone's life differently than the ways we can understand biography from reading it?
Interesting question. I don't really want to pit film against literature. I think they do different things, but with equal value. I have to think about this more, Carolyn, do you have a thought on this?
Well, in film, you're assembling when you're editing the film. It seems to me that you have a range of elements that the biographer with the printed page doesn't have, and so you can arrange the visual images, the archival footage, the voiceovers, and you're putting together a mosaic of the life, that's sequential, and it's interesting. I mean, having that dimension and having the actual voices of a time or footage taken from that time juxtaposed against something in the present. We're jealous, writers are jealous a little bit of filmmakers because of this palette that you have. And there are things that print does in depth that film doesn't have time to do. You would have to make a 73-hour film.
Right.
But so I think it's very different. But I admire your approach to filmmaking.
But I think that what you were describing about the mosaical possibilities, can certainly exist in the printed page, and I think even in the way you constructed your extraordinary memoir, it's not strictly chronological.
Right.
And I imagine there are a number of more experimental approaches to the writing of biography that I'm just not familiar with, but maybe Megan can speak about as well. But
I think
that would mirror some of the things I'm doing in my own film work.
I think also the audience for film is potentially so rather maybe different from those who read biography. I think I wish more people read biography or more kinds of biographies, and maybe that's true of film versions of people's lives. They're the big biopic that everyone has seen, and then there's I mean, let's hope everyone is going to see Her Socialist Smile, and everyone could. It's a different audience maybe is part of what we're getting at. But one thing I felt, I wrote my first two biographies were of 19th century people, and there was I didn't know anyone who knew these people. It was many generations off. There was no film of their lives, and very little photography even. Then I wrote about Elizabeth Bishop. I kept forgetting that I could actually talk to people who knew her, other than a few people I already knew who knew her. I could interview people, and the fact that there was color photos, and so I think maybe depictions of people who live in a film age in film, this may be entirely appropriate and useful. And we don't need to have them brought to life through words. We have images, although you had not as many images as you would have liked.
Although this question came up in another one of these forums, and I sometimes think that had I had more photographs and film footage, that I would have been inclined, in retrospect, not to use it so much. That I think when those images are used more sparingly, they have greater impact, and not to criticize Ken Burns, but since it's familiar, his forms are familiar to most of the audience. Films that are just laden with photographic imagery, I just become sated with those images, and I don't really absorb them that much. I don't remember them that much, and I think it was actually, it proved an advantage to me that I didn't have a whole glut of stock footage and photographs to tell the story.
Well, I was thinking also of the Burns effect of the moving in and moving out and kind of trying to make motion where there isn't motion. And I appreciated the integrity of, your film, and that was part of what I really enjoyed about the words, the unmoving words that were speaking loudly to me through the silence as I read them.
And I do that with in another film that Carolyn worked with me on about the history of the Philippine-American War. When I do use archival photographs, I don't do all of that crawling around the image and trying to animate it somehow. I like my eye to just be able to choose for itself what it wants to focus in on, and not be told what the important part of the image is, or worry that you're going to bore people if they just have to look at a still image without that kind of classic PBS slow camera crawl. They call it, I know a company that works with Ken Burns, and they call that the speed with which the zooms happen, the Ken Burns zoom. Even if other filmmakers use it, it's now a particular pace that's
Interesting. That's interesting.
I have a question that goes along with that. This comes from Cheryl Greenwald. There are moments in the film with a black screen but sound, and other moments with no sound but visual images. Are those meant to be interspersed manifestations of being blind and then being deaf?
Actually, no, not consciously. When there was text or context that I felt the film needed, and I didn't have an appropriate image for it, or really just wanted you to really concentrate on that text, then I was fine with the screen being black. I didn't feel a compulsion that I had to fill up that space with images at every moment. And other times it was just a natural feeling like I needed some breathing space from something that was just said, and to let the nature images support themselves without just nonstop feeding you information. Certain kind of other information comes through in those images, but not,
John, I can see how someone would read that way, but you used that same technique in
the Philippines film.
Yes, in the Philippines film, which was made much earlier. So,
right. So
I think
it's
this
just
is
something
a
that I
signature way of
gravitate
reading.
to,
Yeah.
but I can't explain it other than it's just what feels right.
Yeah.
In a very intuitive way as I'm working. But I know people have made that comment before, that the film is kind of mirroring Helen's private world in some way, and I'm fine with if that, maybe that just was channeling its way through my decision making, but it wasn't an overt intention of mine to do that.
We have another question here about time periods or events not discussed in the film. The Great Depression, the New Deal, the start of the Second World War seem like key moments. And the questioner is wondering whether or not this is because of gaps in the historical record that these were not included.
As I said, my focus was on Helen's political philosophy, ideas, and to some extent the evolution of those ideas through her life. But I wasn't trying to tie them necessarily to the events of the day. At times, the text naturally adhered to a particular moment in time, but other things she said stood apart from any specific historic context. They were just ideas about how we could better construct this world, and so yeah, I think if you read the really fulsome biographies, Joseph Lash's enormous biography of Helen Keller, Helen and Teacher, or Dorothy Herman's book, you can follow Helen's experiences through both world wars, through the Depression, so forth, I was recently sort of curious about what she was doing during the 1918 pandemic, and whether she talked about it at all, but it doesn't seem she mentions it too much. She was in California making her movie, which also I don't talk about. There was a silent biography made of her during her lifetime called Deliverance, and it was a bit of a fiasco, and and she did do something quite interesting when it was done, though, and I thought maybe I should have kept this in. When the film premiered in New York, Actors Equity, the actors union, was going on strike, and Helen decided to support the strike, even though it was affecting the people going into her own movie. And there is a photograph of her outside with a banner protesting it. And she said, "I'd rather see the film fail than to see them mistreat the actors." And she wanted to give, and did eventually, with whatever money that film made, to the IWW. And then towards the end of her life, there's another film called The Unvanquished, which I think you can maybe find on YouTube, which won an Academy Award for Best Documentary Short, and is a portrait of her in later life, but again, says absolutely nothing about her activism, and was, it's one of those 1950s documentaries where clearly nothing authentic is happening. Every movement is, okay, we're going to film you walking up the stairs here, and action, and do this and so forth. And originally I found out that Robert Flaherty was going to make the film, and then they got unhappy with him for various reasons, and that might have been more interesting, portrait of Helen. But
I was quite fascinated by Carolyn's comment that John had coached her on how to read narration, and I wonder if you can tell us a little about that. You do it so beautifully. It seems completely natural, but what was he telling you should be doing?
John is a very meticulous artist. May I call you a perfectionist? Is that all right? We would sometimes have to do quite a few takes on a single phrase, because
really,
not only because of, I would stumble sometimes, there would be a consonant out of place or something, and other times it had to do with the heat or lack thereof. I mean, you know how much heat you're going to give the narrative voice, and we were after something a little neutral. It wasn't always completely neutral, but not to have the voice be too interpretive in terms of what was being said, so it wouldn't seem dramatically propagandistic or something like that. I mean, so we just worked together, and I redid everything he wanted. And then I had this wonderful breakthrough where I read, I don't know what, about 10 pages in a row, and he never stopped me. He didn't stop me. And he said, "We've got it. You were in the groove. We're going to keep that." So I realized, oh, this is learnable. I can learn to do this. So it was exciting.
Yeah, a great moment also where, sometimes we're seeing over your shoulder what you're reading, and there's a point where you read a poem by Anna Strum, I think her name was, and we can't quite tell from the narration whether she's written a poem or she's just giving her thoughts, but we can see over your shoulder it is in the, if we look at the text, it is a poem that you're reading, and I wonder if it felt different getting to that poem as you got, as a poet reading this other.
Yeah, it's well, because you want to honor the lineation without it being awkward, but I like to read poetry somewhat smoothly and naturally, avoiding poet voice and avoiding, awkward sustained pauses at the end of lines, and so I wondered whether I could distinguish that part of it from the rest, which was narrative.
It was
and
great
I also
to have the visual.
Yeah, and the pacing. I mean, the text that I was reading, John produced it, and he has a lot of periodic sentences and a lot of phrases, and you have to know when you're going to breathe when you're reading the text, so that you're pacing it well, and that you have the phrasing down, so that you're giving the reader some time to absorb.
And where was the studio? Was that at Emerson as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
kudos to Emerson's post-production audio staff. Yeah, they helped.
I can't get over that I didn't realize the cameras were rolling. I can't get over that.
I thought you did, because I thought that's why you took your glasses off, and I thought,
Oh, I took them off because I can't see with them. I can't see close with my glasses on.
oh,
So no, but I would have, sure. I mean, that's vanity is another reason. But
oh, I like those glasses.
they're not, I have such disparity in my vision that I can't have everything. So it was very enjoyable to do, as was the Wake film, which I think what John, in my experience with John's films, is he's after something you can't get elsewhere, or that we don't have a version that's hidden. That was true of the history of US involvement in the Philippines too. I mean, the history of the Philippines, which, is known by very few people, I think.
Yeah.
In the
And
US.
what's the title of that film, John?
It's a two-part film. There's two films. First is called Vapor Trail, and then in parentheses, Clark, for the Clark Air Base, which was the US Air Force Base there for close to 100 years. And then second film is called Wake, and then in parentheses, Subic, for the Subic Naval Base. And the two films together are called, For Example, the Philippines, and it's 9 hours long.
Right.
Okay, well, maybe we should look into that for another viewing, kid, someday.
That would be great. We would love to have that in person too. Not
Yes.
for the entire 9 hours, but
Well,
discussion. Well, you could.
It can be done. It can be done. Shoah was shown in a theater.
That's
It was
true.
also, I think,
Yes.
9 hours.
And all these folks who say, "Oh, I can't watch anything that long," half of them are these folks who binge watch these TV series, all weekend, and they
Yes.
don't equate it with watching a 9-hour film.
Well, it was inspiring to work with you, and I'm grateful to learn how to do that.
Well, it meant a lot that Carolyn graced the film with not only her voice, but her spirit. And to me, in the choice of, I can always find somebody, with the skills of a voiceover artist, but I feel that I have a choice that I can also exercise to signal a gesture of solidarity to another artist who aligns with my own feelings about this weird world we're enmeshed in. And so if there's anyone, I can't imagine, but if there's anyone on this chat who hasn't yet encountered Carolyn's work, I hope this is an opportunity to discover more of it. And she has a new book out that maybe Megan wants to point people to.
yeah. Is that the one that I named, or sorry, my.
Carolyn, you could do some self-promotion.
Yes, you can do some promotion. In the Lateness of the World, or is there a newer?
No, there's a new one. It's a translation of Fernando Valverde, and it's called America. And it's a Spanish poet's encounter with America as it is now, including racial strife and awakening and violence and gun violence. And he makes a road trip, so it's not, it's also an open possibility of America. It's quite wonderful. And so that's coming out next month.
Great.
With Copper Canyon. But the other one was In the Lateness of the World.
Yes.
I call it my pandemic poetry book, because after I visited Helen's water pump, I went into lockdown and never gave readings from that book except over Zoom.
Oh,
Yeah.
all right.
I think before we wrap up, I'm going to share my screen one more time. So for those who are interested in the film, it is currently only available for educational purposes. The production company says that it will be available next year, 2022, more widely. That's their belief. But if anyone has questions about screenings of the film or accessing the film or purchasing the film, the contact information is at the bottom of this slide. Lily Spitz at Grasshopper Film has been very helpful in arranging this program, and she's happy to take your questions if you're interested in copies of her Socialist Smile. So I'll just leave that up there for a second, and I'll turn this back over to Megan for any wrap-up comments.
Well, I just
It's
want
also
to
streaming, by the way. There's a streaming service that I don't know what is involved in subscribing to it, but called Mubi, M-U-B-I. And I think if one's a member of that, they also have the film available. But yeah, those prices are really for somebody who wants to buy it for a library or for an academic collection or so forth. But as you said, Kid, I guess in a year they'll make it consumer available. And anyhow, people can, if they track me down, which is very easy to do, I'm always happy to share the work. I didn't make it to keep it to myself. You know, I made it to be seen.
Thank you, John and Carolyn. Thanks so much. Any last points you want to make, Carolyn? Or
No, just thank you everyone for being here.
yes,
And thank you for having me.
thanks to the MHS. So, and tune in to more of the programs. Kid does a great job. So,
Thank you very much. We hope everyone will tune in. We have 2 programs coming up in this coming week, Monday and Tuesday. Take care. We wish you a wonderful afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you in happy and healthier times very soon. Thank you, everyone.
bye-bye.
Bye.